Smoke drifted across the battlefield as distant artillery echoed through the hills. The ground shook with every explosion, and rifle fire cracked through the air in sharp bursts. American infantry moved cautiously forward, scanning hedgerows and ruined buildings for signs of the enemy. Somewhere ahead, German positions were dug in, waiting. Among the soldiers advancing was a young private, small, lean, and barely old enough to shave. His helmet sat low on his head, his rifle steady in his hands. This was not the image most imagined when they thought of a frontline warrior. Yet within months, this same soldier would perform acts of bravery so extraordinary that they would redefine what one man could accomplish in war. This is the story of Audie Murphy, a boy from rural Texas who entered World War II underestimated, overlooked, and repeatedly told he was unfit for combat. But on the battlefields of Europe, under relentless fire and impossible odds, he would prove otherwise. Before the medals, before the legend, there was simply a soldier learning to survive his first battles. Audie Leon Murphy was born on June 20, 1925, in Kingston, Texas, into deep poverty. His childhood was shaped by hardship. His father abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise 7 children alone. From an early age, Audie worked the land, picking cotton and hunting small game to help feed his family. School was a luxury he could not afford. He dropped out early to support his family, learning instead through experience, how to endure exhaustion, how to focus under pressure, and how to use a rifle with precision. Hunting was not recreation, it was survival. Those years quietly forged skills that would later be defined him in combat: patience, accuracy, and calm decision-making. When the United States entered World War II, Murphy was determined to serve. He tried to enlist multiple times, but was rejected by the Marines, Navy units, and airborne units for being too small. Finally, in 1942, at just 17 years old, he was accepted into the U.S. Army. Murphy reported for basic training at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, where military life replaced the rhythms of farm work. Training was intense: long marches, weapons drills, discipline, and constant evaluation. At first, Murphy struggled with authority and routine, but he adapted quickly. Instructors noticed his natural ability with firearms. On the rifle range, he consistently outperformed larger, stronger recruits. His hunting experience translated directly into military marksmanship. Where others rushed shots, Murphy remained calm and precise. He learned quickly, absorbed instruction, and applied it efficiently. Despite his size, Murphy showed resilience. He completed grueling exercises, endured harsh conditions, and learned infantry tactics: movement under fire, use of cover, and coordination with squad members. Slowly, perceptions began to change. He was no longer seen as weak or undersized, but as reliable. By the end of training, Murphy was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, one of the most active combat divisions in the U.S. Army. Soon he would leave the familiarity of home behind and face the reality of war overseas. In 1943, Murphy was sent overseas to North Africa, where American forces were still learning how to fight a modern war. The environment was brutal: heat, dust, mines, and constant tension. Enemy contact was unpredictable, and mistakes were often fatal. Murphy's early missions involved patrols, guard duty, and reconnaissance. These were dangerous tasks, often carried out with limited intelligence. He learned quickly how to read terrain, recognize danger signs, and move cautiously. Small unit combat demanded awareness and discipline, and Murphy adapted well. During patrols, he often volunteered to take forward positions, scanning ahead for enemy movement. His calm under pressure stood out. He did not panic when shots rang out or when artillery landed nearby. Instead, he observed, adjusted, and acted. Though these engagements were smaller than later battles, they were critical to Murphy's development. He learned that survival depended not on strength alone, but on awareness, timing, and precision. Each encounter sharpened his instincts and hardened his resolve. Murphy's first major test came during the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. This was large-scale warfare, amphibious landings, coordinated attacks, and entrenched enemy defenses. The chaos of battle was unlike anything he had experienced. Landing under fire, Murphy moved quickly, staying low, advancing when possible, and firing only when necessary. German machine gun positions dominated key terrain, forcing American troops to fight uphill under constant threat. Murphy used every scrap of cover, advancing with discipline and focus. In one engagement, Murphy helped locate an enemy position firing on his unit. While others hesitated, he maneuvered into a better firing position and engaged the enemy with accuracy, allowing his unit to advance. Actions like these earned him quiet respect among his fellow soldiers. The Sicilian campaign taught Murphy the realities of sustained combat, fatigue, fear, and loss. Yet it also confirmed something important. He belonged on the battlefield. His small stature no longer mattered. His effectiveness did. Following Sicily, the 3rd Infantry Division moved into Italy, where fighting became even more intense. Mountainous terrain favored the defenders, and German forces were experienced and determined. Murphy participated in patrols, ambushes, and defensive actions that tested endurance and nerve. Combat was often close, chaotic, and relentless. Murphy's ability to remain calm under fire became a defining trait. By this point, he was no longer just surviving, he was contributing decisively. He understood when to move, when to wait, and when to act. His commanders began to rely on him, and his fellow soldiers trusted him in dangerous situations. This period marked the transition from inexperienced recruit to seasoned infantryman. The lessons learned in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy would soon prepare Murphy for even greater challenges ahead, challenges that would push him beyond anything he had yet experienced. By the end of his early campaigns, Audie Murphy had been forged by combat. He had faced fear, chaos, and loss, and learned how to operate within them. The boy from Texas had become a soldier shaped by war. What lay ahead in France would test him beyond imagination, but the foundation had been set. Every patrol, every firefight, every decision under pressure had prepared him for the moments that would later define his legacy. By the time the fighting moved beyond the beaches of Sicily, any illusions about war were gone. This was no longer about training, preparation, or theory. It was about endurance. The enemy was experienced, entrenched, and determined to fight for every hill, every village, every road. For Audie Murphy and the men of the 3rd Infantry Division, combat became a daily reality. There were no clear victories, only ground gained at a cost. The terrain was harsh, the enemy relentless, and survival depended on discipline and awareness. Each day brought new lessons, often learned the hardest way possible. Murphy was still young, still small, still relatively unknown, but war was already shaping him into something different. In Sicily and Italy, he would learn not just how to fight, but how to think under fire. After the initial landings, American forces pushed inland through Sicily's rugged terrain. The fighting quickly turned into a brutal uphill struggle. German and Italian units occupied elevated positions, using machine guns and artillery to dominate the valleys below. Murphy's unit advanced cautiously, often under constant fire. Movement was slow and deliberate. Every ridgeline was a potential ambush. Every olive grove concealed danger. Infantry combat here required patience and precision, not speed. Murphy distinguished himself during these operations by his ability to read terrain. He understood where enemy fire was likely to come from and positioned himself accordingly. During one advance, his unit came under machine gun fire from a concealed position. While others sought cover, Murphy identified the source and returned fire with accuracy, suppressing the enemy long enough for his unit to maneuver. Combat in Sicily was exhausting. Soldiers slept in short bursts, often under shell fire. Supplies were limited. Heat and dust wore men down. Murphy endured it all without complaint, focused on the task ahead. His calm presence under fire began to draw notice, not because he sought attention, but because he consistently performed when it mattered. Sicily taught Murphy another lesson. Survival came with a price. He witnessed comrades wounded or killed, sometimes without warning. Artillery strikes and sniper fire could turn routine movement into tragedy in seconds. These experiences hardened him. Fear was always present, but Murphy learned to control it. He relied on observation and discipline, moving deliberately and avoiding unnecessary risks. He began to understand how quickly situations could change and how critical leadership was in moments of confusion. Murphy also learned the importance of small unit cohesion. Trust between soldiers meant everything. In the chaos of combat, orders could be unclear or delayed. Decisions often fell to individuals on the ground. Murphy showed an increasing ability to make those decisions calmly and effectively.
When the campaign shifted to mainland Italy, the fighting intensified. The terrain was mountainous and narrow, favoring defensive positions. German forces were skilled, disciplined, and well prepared. Progress was slow and costly. Murphy's unit engaged in constant patrols and defensive actions. Enemy snipers were a constant threat. Artillery fire was frequent. Infantry clashes were often close range and sudden. Murphy adapted quickly, using cover effectively and coordinating fire with his squad. During one engagement, Murphy helped repel an enemy probe by identifying movement in low-visibility conditions and engaging targets before they could close in. His actions prevented casualties and stabilized the position. Incidents like this were becoming common, quiet acts of effectiveness rather than dramatic gestures. The pressure was relentless. Days blurred together, yet Murphy's focus never wavered. He demonstrated an ability to remain alert even when exhausted, a trait that commanders valued deeply. As fighting continued in Italy, Murphy increasingly took initiative during engagements. He did not wait passively for orders when immediate action was required. He repositioned himself to gain better firing angles, warned comrades of threats, and adjusted tactics as situations evolved. This initiative was not reckless, it was calculated. Murphy understood the risks and acted only when necessary. His judgment under fire improved with experience, and his confidence grew alongside it. Superiors began to recognize his reliability. Fellow soldiers trusted him instinctively. When Murphy moved, others followed. When he fired, it was with purpose. By the end of the Italian campaign, Audie Murphy was no longer simply surviving combat, he was shaping outcomes. The boy from Texas had become a hardened infantryman, capable of enduring sustained combat. His skills, marksmanship, terrain awareness, and composure had been refined through constant exposure to danger. He had learned when to fight, when to wait, and when to move. These experiences did not make him fearless, they made him focused. Italy marked the end of Murphy's apprenticeship in war. What awaited him next, in France, would demand even more. Greater responsibility, greater risk, and acts of courage that would push him beyond anything he had yet faced. Sicily and Italy forged Audie Murphy into a soldier capable of enduring sustained combat. Each battle added discipline, each loss added resolve,
Each decision under fire sharpened his instincts. The lessons learned here would soon be tested on a far greater stage. In France, Murphy would face challenges that demanded not just survival, but leadership, sacrifice, and extraordinary courage. In the summer of 1944, the war entered a new and decisive phase. Allied forces pushed into southern France, determined to break German defenses and drive north. The fighting here would be fast, violent, and unforgiving. For Audie Murphy, France was not just another battlefield, it was the place where everything he had learned would be tested at once. The terrain was different, the enemy hardened, and the pace relentless. There would be no time to adapt slowly. Decisions had to be made instantly, often under direct fire. This was where Murphy would step beyond survival. In France, he would begin to shape battles himself. In August 1944, Murphy landed with the 3rd Infantry Division as part of Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. The objective was to secure ports, cut off German retreat routes, and link up with forces advancing from Normandy. Initial landings met lighter resistance than expected, but that illusion quickly vanished inland. German units regrouped, forming defensive positions in villages, forests, and along narrow roads. Combat became sudden and close. Murphy moved with his unit through unfamiliar terrain, constantly alert for ambushes. German machine guns and snipers targeted advancing infantry. Murphy's awareness and marksmanship once again proved critical. He identified firing positions, returned accurate fire, and helped his unit advance through contested areas. Unlike earlier campaigns, Murphy now carried experience and confidence. He understood how quickly situations could collapse and acted before they did. France brought brutal close-quarters combat. Engagements often occurred at short range, inside forests, among stone buildings, and along hedgerows that concealed enemy movement. During one encounter, Murphy's patrol came under fire from a concealed German position. With limited cover and no immediate support, hesitation could have cost lives. Murphy moved forward, using terrain to shield his approach and engage the enemy position with precise fire. The threat was neutralized, allowing the patrol to continue. Incidents like this became frequent. Murphy repeatedly exposed himself to danger to protect his unit. He took responsibility not because he was ordered to, but because he understood the consequences of delay. His reputation grew rapidly. Fellow soldiers began to rely on him instinctively. When Murphy advanced, others followed. His calm under fire had a stabilizing effect, especially during chaotic engagements. As fighting intensified, Murphy was increasingly placed in positions of responsibility. Casualties among officers and non-commissioned leaders were common, forcing junior soldiers to assume command without warning. Murphy adapted seamlessly. When leaders were wounded or killed, he took charge, organizing defensive positions, directing fire, and ensuring communication between squads. He did not hesitate, and he did not panic. In one engagement, after his unit came under heavy fire, Murphy coordinated movements that prevented the Germans from flanking their position. His quick assessment and decisive action stabilized the situation and prevented further losses. These moments defined Murphy not just as a brave soldier, but as a natural leader. He did not seek authority, but he earned it through competence and courage. By late 1944, Murphy's actions had not gone unnoticed. He was promoted and awarded multiple decorations for bravery under fire. These were not ceremonial honors, they were acknowledgments of repeated acts of courage in lethal situations. Yet Murphy remained focused on the mission. He did not dwell on recognition. His attention stayed on the men beside him and the battles ahead. The pace of combat allowed little time for reflection. Each success was followed by another engagement. Each survival carried the knowledge that tomorrow could be different. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France, German resistance stiffened. Units were ordered to hold ground at all costs. Counterattacks became more aggressive. Artillery fire intensified. Murphy faced increasingly dangerous situations, defensive actions against superior numbers, sudden engagements with armored units, and continuous exposure to fire. Fatigue set in, but his focus never wavered. The experiences in France pushed Murphy closer to the limits of endurance. He had become accustomed to danger, but he had not become careless. Each action was deliberate, every movement calculated. Unbeknownst to him, the defining moment of his military career was approaching. By early 1945, Audie Murphy had become one of the most effective soldiers in his division. His skill, leadership, and courage were undeniable, but the war was far from over. Ahead lay a battle that would demand everything he had: strength, resolve, and the willingness to stand alone against overwhelming odds. The next engagement would define his legacy forever. By late January 1945, the war in Europe had entered its most brutal phase. Germany was retreating, but retreat did not mean surrender. Instead, German forces fought harder, striking with sudden violence wherever Allied lines showed weakness. Near the small village of Holtzwihr, France, winter had tightened its grip. Snow blanketed the fields, trees stood bare and skeletal. Visibility was poor, and the cold slowed both men and machines. Audie Murphy, now a second lieutenant, commanded a company that was stretched thin. They had been fighting continuously for months. Ammunition was low. Reinforcements were uncertain. What Murphy did not yet know was that his company sat directly in the path of a German counterattack involving infantry supported by armor. If the enemy broke through here, the consequences would be devastating, not just for his men, but for the entire sector. This was not a battle that allowed mistakes. The first signs came quietly: movement in the trees, shadows shifting where none should be. Murphy sensed it before the shells began to fall. German artillery opened fire, pounding the American positions with precision. Explosions tore into the frozen earth, showering soldiers with dirt, snow, and metal. Communication lines were disrupted. Men pressed into shallow foxholes, uncertain where the next round would land. Then the infantry emerged. German soldiers advanced in organized waves, using the forest for concealment. Machine guns opened fire, cutting through exposed positions. Tanks and armored vehicles followed, pushing steadily forward. Murphy immediately understood the danger. His company was outnumbered and exposed. If the Germans reached their position, his men would be overwhelmed. He made a decision that would define his legacy. Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to safer ground behind him. This was not abandonment, it was protection. Someone needed to slow the enemy advance. That someone would be him. As Murphy moved forward, he noticed an M10 tank destroyer that had been knocked out earlier in the fighting. The vehicle was burning fiercely. Flames rose from the engine compartment. Smoke poured into the air. Inside the wreckage, ammunition could detonate at any moment. But mounted atop the tank destroyer was a .50 caliber machine gun, still intact, still functional. Murphy understood the risk instantly. Standing on that vehicle meant complete exposure. The fire could explode. Enemy fire would focus on him immediately. But it was also the best firing position available. Without hesitation, Murphy climbed onto the burning tank destroyer. From this elevated position, he had a clear view of the German advance. He could see movement through the trees. He could see infantry closing in. Murphy gripped the machine gun, and he opened fire. The .50 caliber machine gun thundered across the battlefield. Tracers ripped through the forest. German soldiers fell. The advance slowed but did not stop. Murphy fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition. He adjusted his aim constantly, targeting movement, suppressing machine gun nests, forcing the enemy to take cover. German soldiers returned fire almost immediately. Bullets struck the tank destroyer, shrapnel tore through the air, mortar rounds exploded nearby, rocking the ground beneath Murphy's feet. The heat from the flames beneath him was intense. Still, Murphy stayed on the gun. For nearly an hour he fought alone. At one point, a piece of shrapnel tore into his leg, sending pain through his body. Blood soaked into the snow below. The wound was serious, but Murphy refused to leave his position. Through the chaos, Murphy maintained communication. Using a field telephone, he calmly directed artillery fire onto advancing German formations, calling strikes dangerously close to his own position. Shells slammed into the forest, disrupting enemy movement and buying precious time. Every burst of fire, every artillery strike, every second mattered. Murphy was not just firing a weapon, he was holding an entire front line together.
As minutes turned into an hour, the German attack began to falter. Casualties mounted, momentum slowed. What was meant to be a decisive breakthrough became a costly stalemate. Murphy continued firing until the machine gun finally ran out of ammunition. Only then did he climb down from the burning tank destroyer. His leg was badly wounded. He could barely stand. Smoke clung to his uniform. His face was blackened by soot. But the battle was not finished. Murphy limped back to his men, and then, despite his injuries, he led a counterattack. Inspired by what they had witnessed, his company surged forward. German forces, shaken and disorganized, withdrew. The line was restored. Against overwhelming odds, the position had held. When the firing finally stopped, silence settled over the battlefield. Snow was churned into mud. The forest was scarred by shellfire. German dead and wounded lay where the attack had failed. Murphy collapsed only after the danger had passed. He was evacuated for medical treatment, his wounds severe enough to remove him from further combat. Doctors later confirmed that remaining on the tank destroyer had placed him in constant danger of death, not just from enemy fire, but from the burning vehicle itself. Yet Murphy never spoke of fear. To him, it had simply been necessary. The battle at Holtzwihr was not a turning point of the war, but it was a turning point for the men who survived it. Audie Murphy did not hold the line for glory. He did it because retreat would have meant destruction. He did it because his men needed time. On a burning tank destroyer, under constant fire, wounded and alone, he chose to stand. And because he did, dozens of others lived. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the sound that followed was not celebration, but silence. For the men who had survived months and years of constant combat, the absence of gunfire felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. The routines of war, movement, vigilance, danger, had defined their lives for so long that peace felt unreal. For Audie Murphy, the end of the war did not bring relief. It brought distance from his men, from the battlefield, and from the version of himself forged in combat. He had survived what many did not. He had stood alone under fire. He had made decisions that determined who lived and who did not. Now the war was over. But survival carried a weight that did not disappear when the fighting stopped. Murphy returned to the United States as a national symbol of courage. Newspapers printed his photograph. Crowds applauded him. Leaders praised his service. He was only 20 years old, yet he carried the experiences of a lifetime of war. Publicly, he was celebrated as a hero. Privately, he struggled to adjust to civilian life. The noise of everyday life startled him.
Darkness brought memories he could not silence. Sleep came only in fragments. At the time, there was no widespread understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Veterans were expected to return home, resume normal lives, and move forward. Murphy tried, but the battlefield had followed him home. He avoided crowds, he slept with a weapon nearby. He suffered from nightmares so severe that he often woke drenched in sweat, reliving moments of combat he could not forget. The war had taught him how to survive. It had not taught him how to stop fighting. Hollywood soon took interest in Audie Murphy. His story was compelling. A young man from poverty who became the most decorated American soldier of World War II. He began acting in films, often portraying soldiers. Eventually, he would even portray himself in To Hell and Back, a film based on his own wartime experiences. On screen, the war was controlled. Scenes had beginnings and endings. Violence was framed. The chaos was edited. Real war was not like that. While acting provided structure and purpose, it also forced Murphy to relive moments he had spent years trying to suppress. The line between performance and memory blurred. Despite his success, Murphy continued to struggle internally. He became dependent on sleeping pills. He experienced bouts of depression and anger. He rarely spoke openly about his pain, but it shaped his life. Yet even in this struggle, Murphy showed courage of a different kind. Unlike many veterans of his time, Murphy eventually chose to speak publicly about the psychological cost of war. He criticized the lack of support for returning soldiers. He spoke about nightmares, fear, and the difficulty of adjusting to civilian life. At a time when such topics were often dismissed or ignored, Murphy forced them into the conversation. He was not seeking sympathy, he was seeking understanding. Murphy believed that courage did not end on the battlefield. It extended into survival, into living with memories no one else could fully understand. By speaking openly, he gave voice to countless veterans who could not.
Despite his fame, Murphy remained deeply humble. He never saw himself as extraordinary. He insisted that he had simply done what was required of him. He avoided emphasizing his medals. He credited his survival to luck and to the men who fought beside him, many of whom did not return. This humility defined his character. He remembered the fallen. He carried their absence quietly. Murphy's heroism was not rooted in ego. It was rooted in responsibility, to his unit, to his duty, and to the memory of those lost. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy died in a plane crash in Virginia. He was 45 years old. The nation mourned. Veterans honored him. Tributes poured in from across the country. Murphy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. At his request, his gravestone was simple. No mention of his many decorations, not even the Medal of Honor. Just his name, his rank, his service. It was a final reflection of the man he had always been. Audie Murphy's story is often told through numbers: decorations earned, enemies repelled, battles survived. But those numbers do not tell the whole story. His life reminds us that heroism is not about invincibility. It is about endurance, about standing when retreat seems easier, about carrying the weight of survival long after the war ends. Murphy stood on a burning tank destroyer to save his men, and then he spent the rest of his life carrying the cost of that courage. His legacy is not just one of bravery, but of truth. War leaves marks that medals cannot erase,
and courage does not end when the fighting stops.